The rain had just stopped when Elena arrived at the tall iron gates of the Reed mansion. Her shoes were muddy from the long walk up the hill, and the cold wind brushed against her cheeks as she clutched her small bag close to her chest. It was her first day working there, and though she tried to keep her back straight, she could not hide the fear that sat quietly in her heart. The mansion was enormous, shining under the gray sky. Windows stretched across every wall, and marble stairs led up to a heavy oak door. She had never seen such a place in her life. When she pressed the doorbell, the echo of its chime felt like it could wake the whole city. A butler opened the door, dressed in a black suit, his face strict but not unkind. "You must be the new maid," he said, looking her over. Elena nodded quickly, trying not to seem nervous. The man led her inside, where the scent of polished wood and fresh flowers filled the air. Every corner of the house looked like something out of a magazine: paintings in gold frames, sparkling chandeliers, and soft rugs that felt like clouds under her feet. But what caught her eyes most was the grand piano sitting in the middle of the main hall. It was white, with gentle curves that gleamed beneath the light. She stopped for a moment, her eyes fixed on it. The sight pulled her back to a memory she had tried hard to bury: her father's small music room. The smell of old paper sheets, the sound of his voice, patient and loving, saying, "Feel the music, don't just play it." That piano looked just like the one they had before everything was taken away. "Elena," the butler's voice snapped her back. "Come. Mr. Reed doesn't like delays." She lowered her eyes and followed him quickly. Alexander Reed was not the kind of man who smiled. In his late 30s, he had built his fortune from real estate and luxury businesses. People said he could make or break someone's career with one phone call. He stood by the window, talking on the phone, wearing a gray suit that looked like it cost more than everything Elena owned. His words were sharp, his tone impatient. When he hung up, his eyes landed on her. "So you're the new help," he said flatly. "The last one didn't last 2 weeks. Let's see if you can do better." "Yes, sir," she replied softly. He waved his hand. "You'll handle cleaning, serving when guests come, and keeping the piano dust-free. But don't touch it. That piano costs more than your life." The words stung, but Elena only nodded. She had learned long ago that silence was safer than pride. She spent the next few days working quietly, moving through the mansion like a shadow, dusting furniture, arranging flowers, polishing glasses, and making sure her presence never disturbed her employer. Still, every time she walked past that piano, something inside her stirred. Her fingers itched to touch the keys just once. Music had been her only comfort when life was kind and when it turned cruel. But now it belonged to a different world, a world she no longer belonged to. One evening, a week later, Mr. Reed held a gathering for his business partners. The mansion buzzed with laughter and clinking glasses. Elena moved quietly between the guests, serving drinks and making sure everything stayed perfect. She could hear their conversations, talks of investments, art, and travel. None of them looked at her except to ask for another drink. As she passed near the piano, she paused again, her eyes resting on it. She didn't realize Mr. Reed was watching her from across the room. He noticed the look in her eyes, a look too curious, too familiar for someone in her position. He smirked and whispered something to his friend beside him. The man laughed, shaking his head. "You're not serious," the friend said. "Watch," Alexander replied with a cruel glint in his eyes. He clapped his hands once to get everyone's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying across the room, "tonight we've had great wine, fine food, and wonderful company. But perhaps we're missing a touch of music," the guests murmured, curious. Alexander's eyes settled on Elena. "You," he said suddenly. "Come here." Elena froze, the tray in her hands trembling slightly. "Me, sir?" "Yes, you. You seem to like staring at my piano. Let's see if you can actually play it." The guests chuckled. A few whispered to each other, already sensing his cruel intent. Elena's heart thumped painfully in her chest. "I don't think I should—" "Oh, don't be shy," Alexander interrupted, smiling coldly. "It's not every day the help gets to entertain millionaires." Everyone laughed except Elena. She wanted to disappear, but refusing wasn't an option. Slowly, she set the tray down and walked toward the piano. Each step felt heavier than the last. The laughter around her grew faint, replaced by the sound of her heartbeat in her ears. She sat down on the bench. Her hands hovered above the keys, trembling slightly. The surface felt smooth and cold. She hadn't touched a piano in years. not since her father's accident. The room seemed to blur around her as old memories came rushing back. The day they sold their piano, the day she left music school, the day everything changed. Well? Alexander's voice cut through her thoughts. Play something, anything. Elena closed her eyes. Her fingers pressed a few soft keys, uncertain at first, then steadier. A simple melody formed, something small she remembered from her childhood. The sound was gentle, fragile, like a whisper. Some guests smiled politely, expecting her to stumble soon. But as she continued, the notes began to blend into something deeper. Her body remembered what her mind had forgotten. Her hands moved gracefully, shaping the melody into emotion. She forgot about the people around her. For a moment, it was just her and the music again. The laughter died down. The whispers stopped. The melody filled the hall, soft yet powerful. Her eyes stayed closed as she played. Every note a memory, every chord a breath she had held for years. Even the air seemed to stand still. Alexander's smirk faded slowly. He leaned forward, watching her with disbelief. The sound coming from his piano was not that of a servant fumbling with keys. It was the sound of someone who had lived through pain and turned it into beauty. When the final note faded, silence wrapped around the room. No one moved for several seconds. Elena kept her hands on the keys, afraid to look up. Then quietly she stood, her face pale but calm. "I'm sorry if that wasn't good enough, sir," she whispered. Her words seemed to shake Alexander from his trance. The guests began to clap softly at first, then louder. But their applause only embarrassed her. She bowed slightly and stepped back, eyes lowered. Alexander said nothing. His usual arrogance was gone, replaced by confusion. He had wanted to humiliate her, to remind her of her place. But instead she had shown him something he hadn't expected. Real talent, real feeling. Something money couldn't buy. Elena turned to leave, but one of the guests stopped her. "That was beautiful," the woman said kindly. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Elena forced a small smile. "My father taught me, ma'am. A long time ago." Alexander's eyes narrowed slightly. There was something in her tone, something that hinted at a story he didn't know. But he stayed quiet, letting her walk away. Later that night, after the guests had left, Elena returned to the main hall to clean up. The piano still stood there, silent and proud. She touched it gently just for a second and whispered, "Thank you." Then she continued her work. Upstairs, Alexander sat in his study, replaying the music in his mind. He poured himself a drink, trying to shake the strange feeling in his chest. It wasn't anger or pride. It was something else, something he hadn't felt in years. Maybe regret, maybe admiration. He wasn't sure yet. Downstairs, Elena finished cleaning and put her coat on. As she walked out into the cold night, she didn't notice the curtain move slightly from Alexander's window above. He was watching her leave, a thoughtful expression on his face. For the first time, he wondered who she really was. The next morning, the mansion felt different. The usual air of control and perfection seemed softer, quieter somehow. The sunlight streamed through the tall windows, falling on the same piano that had changed everything the night before. Elena tried not to look at it as she dusted the furniture nearby, but her eyes kept drifting toward it. Every time she remembered how she had played in front of all those people, her heart started racing again. She still couldn't believe she had done it. She didn't sleep much after the party. The moment she lay down in her small room, her mind kept replaying the sound of the notes, the silence that followed, and the way her hands had trembled afterward. She didn't know what her employer thought of it all, and that worried her. Maybe he would fire her for disobeying, even though he had ordered her to play. Maybe he didn't like that she embarrassed him in front of his guests. When she heard footsteps in the hallway, she quickly straightened up, pretending to dust the shelf. The butler appeared first, holding a tray of papers and coffee. "Mr. Reed wants to see you in his study," he said. His tone gave nothing away, and that made her even more nervous. Her hands felt cold as she walked down the long hallway. The floor gleamed beneath her feet, reflecting the morning light. She stopped outside the study door, took a breath, and knocked softly. "Come in," a voice called from inside. Alexander Reed sat behind his desk, reading a file. He didn't look up right away, which gave her a moment to notice the details of the room. The tall bookshelves, the framed photos of him shaking hands with powerful people, the smell of coffee and paper. Finally, he lifted his eyes. "So, he said slowly, setting the file aside. You can actually play. Elena clasped her hands together. I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean to overstep. You told me not to touch the piano and… He raised a hand to stop her. Relax, I told you to play, didn't I? She nodded, unsure if that meant she was safe. He studied her face for a moment, then leaned back in his chair. Where did you learn? My father taught me, sir, she said quietly. He was a music teacher before he passed away. There was a brief silence. Something flickered in Alexander's eyes, but it vanished quickly. I see, he said. Well, you surprised everyone. Even me. Elena lowered her gaze, not knowing what to say. Thank you, sir. He stood and walked toward the window, his hands in his pockets. You played with emotion. That's rare. Most people who claim to love music only love the attention it brings. He turned slightly. But you… It looked like you were somewhere else when you played. Elena hesitated, unsure if she should answer. Music was the only thing that made sense when everything else fell apart. She said softly. I guess I just got lost in it. Alexander didn't respond right away. Then, with a hint of curiosity, he asked, Did you study it formally? Yes, for a short time, she said. At the conservatory. But I couldn't finish. My family lost everything after my father's accident and I had to leave school. He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. You may go now, he said after a moment. And Elena… She froze, waiting. You played beautifully, her chest tightened. She wasn't sure if he meant it, but the words still warmed her heart. Thank you, sir, she whispered and left quietly. That day passed in silence. Alexander didn't call for her again, but she noticed him walk by the piano once or twice, pausing for a second before continuing on. The maids whispered among themselves, wondering what had happened during the party, but Elena stayed quiet. She didn't want to talk about it. She just wanted to do her work and stay invisible again. In the evening, she went to the kitchen to clean up after dinner. The butler came in carrying a note. Mr. Reed wants you to clean the main hall tonight. There are fingerprints on the piano lid from the party, he said simply, handing her the key to the room. Elena nodded. She waited until everyone else had gone to bed, then walked to the hall. The house was silent now. The only sound, the faint hum of the wind outside. The piano stood in the middle of the room, glowing faintly under the chandelier. She ran her cloth gently over the surface, wiping away the smudges. Her fingers lingered on the keys, brushing them softly. She pressed one note, just one, and it rang through the empty hall, warm and lonely. Before she knew it, her hands began to move again, forming the same melody she had played the night before. She played quietly, afraid someone might hear, but unable to stop. What she didn't know was that Alexander was awake. He had been walking through the corridor when he heard the faint sound of music. He stopped, listening. The melody was soft, full of feeling. It wasn't a performance this time, it was something raw and honest. He stepped closer to the door but didn't go in. He just stood there, watching through the slightly open doorway. Elena's eyes were closed as she played. Her expression was calm, her movements gentle. When she finished, she rested her hands on the keys and sighed, a small smile touching her lips. Alexander turned away quietly before she noticed him and went back to his room. But the sound of her music stayed in his mind long after it had stopped. The next morning, he was quieter than usual. At breakfast, his business partner came by to discuss an upcoming deal. Alexander listened but seemed distracted. You're not yourself today, the man said, half joking. Still thinking about that maid's performance? Alexander gave a small smirk. Maybe it was unexpected, his friend laughed. You impressed by a maid? That's new, Alexander didn't answer. He wasn't sure how to explain it. Something about her music had stirred something he thought he'd buried years ago. He had grown used to a world where everything had a price, where people smiled only because they wanted something. But her music wasn't like that. It was pure. It reminded him of a time when things were simpler, when his late mother used to play in the old house before she passed away. That night, he found himself walking back to the hall again. The piano waited there, silent. He touched one of the keys and thought of her. Then, almost without realizing it, he left a small envelope on top of the piano with her name written on it. The next morning, when Elena came to dust, she found the envelope. Inside was a short note in neat handwriting. Play again tonight. No guests, just you. A.R. Her hands trembled as she read it. She didn't know whether to be afraid or thankful. Maybe he wanted to test her again, or maybe he was being kind. She couldn't tell. All day she couldn't focus on her work. Her thoughts kept returning to the piano, the note and the strange way her employer's eyes had softened when he last spoke to her. When night came, she went to the hall again. The lights were dim, and Alexander sat quietly in a chair near the fireplace, a glass of wine in his hand. He nodded toward the piano. "Go ahead," he said simply. Elena sat down. Her heart raced. She took a deep breath and began to play. This time she chose a different piece, something light but full of emotion. The notes floated through the air, filling the room with calm warmth. Alexander listened without saying a word, his face unreadable. When she finished, there was a long silence before he spoke. "You play like someone who has lived 100 lives," he said quietly. "How old are you?" 24, she replied softly. He nodded. "And yet your music sounds older than that." She didn't know what to say. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled gently, filling the silence between them. Finally, he said, "You may go." She stood, bowing her head politely, but as she turned to leave, he added, "Elena, thank you." Her eyes met his, and for the first time there was no arrogance in his expression, only something that looked like respect. That night, as she lay in her bed, she thought about how strange life could be. Just a few days ago, he had humiliated her in front of everyone. Now he listened to her like her music meant something. She didn't understand what had changed, but deep down, she felt something too, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The following days passed quietly, but the silence inside the mansion felt heavier than before. It was as if the air itself remembered the music that had once filled it. Every time Elena walked past the grand piano, she felt its presence like a heartbeat waiting to be heard again. She tried to stay busy, to focus on her duties, but her mind wandered back to that moment, his face when she finished playing, the silence that followed, and how something had shifted between them. Alexander Reed had not spoken much to her since that evening. He spent his mornings locked in his study and his nights taking long walks through the empty halls. But now, when he saw her working, he did not carry the same coldness in his eyes. He would glance at her as if he wanted to say something, but then he would stop himself and walk away. One afternoon, Elena was dusting the large shelves in the library when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned and saw Alexander standing there holding a cup of coffee. He looked tired, his expression softer than usual. "You can leave the books," he said. "Come sit for a moment." She froze, unsure if she heard him right. "Sir?" "I said sit," he repeated, though his tone wasn't harsh. It sounded almost thoughtful. She hesitated, then sat down on one of the chairs near the window. Sunlight poured across the wooden floor, lighting up the dust floating in the air. Alexander placed his cup on the table and looked at her. "Do you know why I bought that piano?"
he asked suddenly. She shook her head.
"No, sir. It belonged to my mother," he said quietly. "She was a pianist. That's where I first learned to appreciate music. But when she died, I stopped listening. I didn't play. I didn't want to feel anything." Elena listened carefully, surprised that he was sharing something personal. "I'm sorry," she said softly. He nodded but didn't respond for a few seconds. "When you played that night," he continued, "it felt like she was in the room again. I haven't felt that in a long time." His eyes met hers briefly. That's not something money can buy. She didn't know what to say. No one had ever told her something like that before, especially not a man like him. "Music has a way of finding what words can't," she said quietly. He smiled faintly. "Maybe that's why I keep hearing it even when you're not playing." Then, as if realizing how personal his words sounded, he straightened his posture and cleared his throat. "Anyway," he said, "I'm hosting another dinner next week. I want you to play again." Her eyes widened. "Play again? In front of guests?" "Yes, this time not as a servant." He paused, studying her face. "You'll play as a guest." Elena didn't know how to respond. She had never been treated as anything more than staff. "I don't think that's right, sir," she said nervously. "Your guests might not like that." He shook his head. "They'll like what I tell them to like. I want you to play. That's final." She wanted to argue but didn't dare. She only nodded and said quietly, "Yes, sir." The rest of the week felt like a dream. During the day, she continued her chores, but at night, when everyone else was asleep, she practiced at the piano. The music filled the hall softly, echoing through the empty rooms. Each night she grew braver, her fingers remembering what they once knew. Sometimes she felt as though her father's hands were guiding hers, helping her find her way back. Unbeknownst to her, Alexander often listened from afar. He would stand by the doorway or the staircase, hidden in shadow, just to hear her play. The sound calmed him in ways he didn't understand. For years he had measured success by numbers and deals. But now, for the first time, he found peace in something simple and human. The night of the dinner arrived quickly. The mansion was glowing, again filled with guests dressed in elegant clothes and the scent of wine and flowers. Elena wore a plain but neat white dress one of the maids had helped her press. She looked nothing like the shy servant who had first entered the house. Her hands still trembled, but this time it wasn't from fear, it was from anticipation. Alexander noticed her standing by the piano and walked over. "Don't be nervous," he said quietly. "Just do what you did before. Let them hear what I heard." She nodded, her throat too tight for words. The room was full of laughter and conversation until Alexander lifted his hand. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice clear and commanding. "Tonight, before we dine, I want you to listen to something special. This young woman will play for us. Her name is Elena." A few guests looked surprised, whispering to each other. "The maid?" one of them murmured, but Alexander ignored them. Elena sat at the piano. The same piano that had once been used to humiliate her was now the center of attention again, but this time she had nothing to prove. She took a deep breath and began to play. The first notes floated softly through the hall. The melody was different this time, warmer, fuller, filled with emotion and light. It was a piece her father used to play when she was a child, one that always made her feel safe. The sound grew richer with every note, pulling everyone into its rhythm. At first, the guests whispered among themselves, but soon the room fell silent. Even the sound of glasses stopped. All eyes turned toward her, watching the way she played with such honesty and grace. Her fingers moved gently, confidently, each note touching something deep inside the listeners. Alexander stood to the side, his expression unreadable, but his eyes never left her. The music seemed to reach him in ways he couldn't describe. He saw the strength behind her calmness, the emotion behind her simplicity. For the first time, in years he felt something stir in his chest, a mix of admiration, respect, and maybe something more. When the final note faded, there was a long silence before the guests began to applaud. The sound of their clapping filled the hall, louder than before. Elena looked up, her eyes wide in disbelief. She stood, bowing slightly, but her gaze went straight to Alexander. He smiled, not the cold, proud smile she had seen before, but a real one, a smile of gratitude. The applause lasted a long time. A few guests came forward to compliment her, asking where she had studied, who her teacher was. She answered politely, but inside she felt light, free, as if all the years of struggle had finally meant something. After the dinner ended and the guests had gone, Elena stayed behind to clean up, though the other staff offered to do it for her. She said she didn't mind. She just wanted a moment alone with the piano. Alexander appeared after a while, still dressed in his suit but without his usual guarded look. "You were incredible," he said simply. "Thank you, sir," she said, smiling shyly. "I didn't expect them to like it." "They didn't just like it," he replied. "You moved them. That's rare." She looked down at the keys, her voice soft. "My father used to say music is a way to speak without words. Maybe they heard something I was trying to say." He nodded. "Maybe so." For a while, they stood in silence, the only sound the ticking of the clock on the wall. Then he said quietly, "You know, I think my mother would have liked you." She looked up, surprised. "Why's that?" She believed that kindness and talent often come from the same place, the heart, he said. "And tonight, you proved her right." Her eyes softened. "Thank you, sir. That means a lot." He smiled again, faint but genuine. "You don't have to call me sir when it's just the two of us." She blinked, unsure how to respond. Then, "What should I call you?" He thought for a moment, then said, "Alexander." It felt strange saying his name, but she nodded slowly. "All right." When he left the room, she sat again at the piano, pressing one soft note. The sound lingered in the air like a promise. For the first time since she had come to the mansion, she didn't feel like just a maid. She felt like someone who had been seen. Upstairs, Alexander stood by the balcony looking out at the night sky. The stars were faint, hidden behind the clouds, but he could still hear the echo of her music in his mind. Something had changed, and he knew it wasn't just her. It was him too. The morning after the dinner, the house was quiet again. The laughter, the applause, and the music from the night before were gone, leaving behind only the echo of memories. Elena woke up early, as she always did, but something inside her felt different. There was a small spark of joy in her heart, a feeling she hadn't known in years. For the first time since she started working at the mansion, she felt like she belonged there, even if just a little. Downstairs, she moved through her morning, routine as usual, dusting the hallways, setting the table, polishing the glasses, but her mind was still lost in the melody she had played. Every note seemed to follow her, reminding her of the look on her employer's face when she finished. He had changed somehow, and though she didn't understand it, she could feel it. When she walked past the study door later that morning, she heard voices inside. One of them was Alexander's, deep and calm. The other sounded like a woman's, confident and sharp. "I saw what you did last night," the woman was saying. "You let the maid play, in front of all your guests?" "It was my decision," Alexander replied, his tone controlled. "I'm sure it was, but do you have any idea what people are saying? They think you've lost your mind. You turned a servant into entertainment." There was silence for a moment. Elena realized she shouldn't be listening, but her feet refused to move. Then Alexander's voice came again, colder this time. "I don't care what they think. She played better than any of the professionals I've hired, and she did it with heart." The woman scoffed softly. "Heart doesn't make money, Alexander. It makes something better," he said. "It makes meaning." Elena's chest tightened at those words. She slipped away quietly before anyone could see her. She didn't want to cause trouble for him. She was just a maid who happened to know how to play. She didn't deserve his attention, nor the criticism he might face because of her. That afternoon, she worked in the garden, trimming the flowers and cleaning the fountain. The sky was bright and blue, and for a while, she let herself breathe. She thought about her father again. How proud he would have been to see her play like that. He always told her that no matter where life took her, she should never let her gift go to waste. She wiped her hands on her apron when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned and saw Alexander standing near the garden gate, his hands in his pockets. He looked thoughtful, not angry. "You disappeared after the dinner," he said, stepping closer. "Why?" She looked down at the ground. "I didn't want to bother you, sir." He smiled faintly. "You're the first person who thinks playing beautiful music could be a bother." She blushed slightly. "I heard someone talking in your study this morning. I didn't mean to overhear, but I did. I don't want to cause any problems for you." He studied her for a moment, then said softly, "You didn't cause problems. You reminded people that there's more to life than business and appearances. Maybe they needed that." She didn't know what to say. Her throat felt tight. "Thank you, sir," she whispered. He motioned toward a bench under the old oak tree. "Sit for a moment." They sat quietly, the sound of birds filling the air. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then Alexander said, "You mentioned before that your family lost everything after your father's accident. What happened?" Elena hesitated. The story was painful, one she rarely told, but there was something honest in his tone that made her trust him. "My father was a music teacher," she began softly. "He ran a small academy in town. He taught children from all kinds of families, rich and poor. He loved music more than anything. But one day there was a problem with the funding for the academy. The investors pulled out, claiming he had misused the money. He was heartbroken. We lost our home, and he fell ill not long after. He passed away before he could prove his innocence. Alexander's eyes darkened. That's terrible. She nodded slowly. After he died, I found out the truth. One of the companies that withdrew support had been pressured by a large real estate group that wanted the land for development. The academy was destroyed, and in its place they built luxury apartments. She smiled bitterly. I guess that's how life works for people like us. Alexander froze. Do you remember the name of the company? Yes, she said. It was Reed Holdings. For a moment there was only silence between them. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying away the sound of her words. Alexander's expression changed. He stood slowly, turning his face away from her. Reed Holdings, he repeated under his breath. That's my company. Elena looked up, startled. Your company? He didn't answer right away. His hands clenched at his sides. I didn't know. It was years ago. I had just taken over from my father. That project, I remember the deal. The land was cheap because of some issue with the previous owner. I never looked into it. Her chest tightened and she looked away. You don't have to explain, sir. It's not your fault. Her voice broke slightly. I just wish things had been different. He turned toward her, his face full of regret. If what you're saying is true, then my company destroyed your father's dream. I'm so sorry. She shook her head. It's in the past. Nothing can change it now, but he couldn't let it go. He stared out across the garden, his jaw tight. My father built that company with one rule. Never let emotions get in the way of business. I followed that rule for years. I thought it made me strong. But I see now it only made me blind. Elena wanted to tell him it wasn't his fault, but something in his eyes stopped her. He looked like a man who had just realized the cost of his success. He finally said, I owe you more than an apology. I owe your father something too. She stood quickly. You don't owe me anything. I don't want charity, sir. It's not charity, he said firmly. It's justice. He walked away before she could argue. That night she couldn't sleep. She sat by her window, watching the moonlight pour across the lawn, wondering what he meant. She had never seen him look so human before, so full of guilt and sincerity. For years she had carried the weight of that loss alone, but seeing his reaction somehow made it lighter. The next day, she noticed unusual activity around the house. Assistants came and went, bringing files and blueprints. Alexander was on the phone for hours, pacing through his study. When she brought him his coffee, she saw papers spread across his desk, maps of the Old Town District, names of former property owners, and a file marked Reed Holdings Community Projects. What are you doing? She asked quietly. He looked up, his expression serious. I'm fixing a mistake. Before she could say more, the butler entered and reminded him about his meeting. Alexander gave her a small nod before leaving the room. Over the next week, he was barely home. He visited the city office, spoke to lawyers, and met with community leaders. When he finally returned, he looked exhausted but at peace. He found Elena cleaning the main hall. I went to the site, he said simply. She turned confused. The site? The place where your father's academy used to be, he said. It's still standing. Part of the old structure is hidden behind the newer buildings. I'm buying it back. Her eyes widened.
What? Why?
He smiled softly. Because it was never ours to take. I'm turning it into a free music school in your father's name. You'll run it when it's ready. Her mouth fell open, and for a long moment she couldn't speak. You can't be serious. I am, he said. It's the least I can do. Tears filled her eyes, but she quickly wiped them away. You don't have to do this. I know, he said gently. But I want to. For a moment they stood in silence. Then for the first time she smiled. Not the polite smile she gave when serving or cleaning, but a real one, full of gratitude. Thank you, she whispered. He nodded. Thank you for reminding me what really matters. That night, as Elena played softly on the piano, Alexander listened from the doorway once again. But this time he didn't feel like a master watching his maid. He felt like a man who had finally begun to make things right. Days turned into weeks, and slowly the mansion began to feel different. The same walls that once carried silence and pride now carried the faint sound of music. Every morning, before the sun fully rose, Elena played softly in the main hall. The notes were calm and steady, like the rhythm of a peaceful heart. The servants, who used to hurry through their chores, often paused for a moment just to listen. It made the house feel alive again. Alexander had kept his promise. He had started the process of buying back the land where Elena's father's academy once stood. It wasn't easy. The property had changed hands several times, and the people involved only cared about profit. But Alexander didn't back down. Every time he faced a legal issue or a greedy investor, he thought of Elena's music, the purity of it, the pain hidden within it, and it pushed him forward. Elena didn't know all the details, but she could sense his effort. She could see it in the tired lines on his face and the quiet determination in his eyes. Sometimes when she brought him his tea, he would smile faintly and say, "Almost there." She would nod, not needing to ask what he meant. One evening, after finishing her work, she found a letter slipped under her door. It was written in neat handwriting. "Meet me in the music hall tomorrow morning." The next morning, when she entered the hall, she found Alexander waiting near the piano. He wasn't wearing his usual suit, just a simple shirt and trousers. It was strange seeing him look so relaxed. On the piano stood a folder filled with papers and a small key. He looked up as she entered. "It's done," he said quietly. She frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" He smiled. "The land. The building that used to be your father's academy. It's yours now. The papers are in there." He pointed to the folder. "And that key opens the door." Elena froze. For a long moment she couldn't speak. Her eyes filled with tears she couldn't hold back. "Mine?" she whispered. "You're giving it to me?" He nodded. "It belongs to you more than it ever belonged to me. I'm only giving back what should never have been taken." Her voice trembled. "I don't know what to say." "Then don't say anything," he said softly. "Just promise me one thing. Bring music back to that place. Not for me, not for the company, for your father and for yourself." She wiped her tears and smiled through them. "I promise." He looked at her for a long moment before saying, "There's something else. There's a charity gala next month, big event, lots of press, investors, musicians. I want you to perform there." She blinked, unsure she heard him right. "Perform?" "At the gala?" "Yes," he said simply. "You deserve to be heard. People should know who you are." She shook her head quickly. "I can't, sir. I'm not ready for something like that." "You said the same thing before you played in front of my guests," he reminded her with a faint smile. "And look what happened." She bit her lip. "That was different. This would be big. People will judge me." "Let them," he said firmly. "You faced worse and still stood tall. You'll do fine." She wanted to argue again, but something in his tone stopped her. He wasn't ordering her this time, he was encouraging her. For a man who had once only cared about control and power, it was a rare kind of kindness. She nodded slowly. "All right," she said softly. Kursai, over the next few weeks, Elena every night. Sometimes she stayed up until midnight, her fingers aching, her mind filled with doubts and hopes. The butler would find her sitting by the piano long after everyone had gone to bed. "You should rest," he'd say gently. But she would smile and reply, "Just one more song." Alexander often watched her quietly from a distance. He never interrupted, never gave her instructions. He just listened. Sometimes he would bring her tea and leave it on the table without a word. There was a silent understanding between them now, a respect built on something deeper than gratitude. When the day of the gala finally arrived, Elena could hardly breathe. The event was being held in one of the grandest halls in the city. The chandeliers sparkled like stars, and people dressed in elegant clothes filled the room. It was a world she didn't belong to, yet somehow she was part of it now. Backstage, her hands trembled as she adjusted her simple white dress. She could hear the murmur of the crowd and the soft music playing in the background. Alexander appeared beside her, calm and confident as always. "Are you ready?" he asked. "I don't know," she admitted honestly. "I feel like my heart might jump out of my chest." He chuckled softly. "That just means you care. When you sit at that piano, remember, it's not about them. It's about you and your music." She looked up at him and smiled nervously. "Thank you for believing in me." He smiled back. "You made it easy." When it was her turn, she walked out onto the stage. The lights felt blinding at first, and the faces in the crowd blurred together. She took a deep breath and sat at the piano. The room grew quiet, waiting. Her fingers touched the keys, and just like that, the fear began to fade. She started with a soft melody, one her father had written long ago. The sound filled the hall, gentle but powerful, weaving through the air like a story only she could tell. The audience listened, completely silent. Each note carried a piece of her past, the pain, the loss, the hope. She remembered the little girl who used to sit beside her father, watching his fingers move gracefully across the keys. She remembered the nights she cried, wishing for a chance to play again. And she remembered the man who had once humiliated her, now sitting in the front row, watching with quiet pride. When the last note faded, the silence stretched for a moment. Then the applause came, loud, thunderous, and real. People stood, clapping and cheering. Elena's heart swelled with emotion. Tears filled her eyes, but this time they weren't from pain. They were from joy. She looked toward Alexander, who was already standing, clapping with a proud smile on his face. Their eyes met and no words were needed. He simply nodded and she nodded back. After the performance, many people approached her, praising her talent, asking where she had trained, and offering opportunities. She answered humbly, never forgetting where she came from. A few journalists even asked to write about her story, but she politely declined. "It's not about me," she said. "It's about the music." Later that night, when the event was over and the guests had left, Elena stepped outside to breathe. The cool night air felt fresh on her skin. She looked up at the stars, remembering her father's words. "Music will always find you no matter where life takes you." Alexander joined her a few moments later, holding 2 cups of coffee. "You were amazing," he said quietly. "Thank you," she said. "I still can't believe it happened." He smiled. "Believe it. You've earned it." They stood in silence for a while, watching the lights of the city below. Then she said softly, "You changed my life." He looked at her, his voice gentle. "You changed mine first." The words lingered in the air, simple but honest. There was no need for more. They both knew what they had gone through, what they had learned. It wasn't just about music or money. It was about forgiveness, second chances, and the beauty of doing what's right. A week later, they visited the old academy together. The workers were already there, cleaning and preparing the building for renovation. The sign outside read, "Cruz Music School, in memory of a dream." Elena touched the worn wall gently, tears forming in her eyes. "He would have loved this," she whispered. Alexander nodded. "Then let's make sure his dream lives on." And together they stepped inside, ready to begin again. The halls were dusty and broken, but she could already imagine them filled with laughter, with children learning, with music flowing freely once more. For Elena, it was more than just a dream come true. It was proof that kindness could heal even the deepest wounds. And for Alexander, it was redemption, a way to finally make peace with the past. As the sun set behind the old building, its golden light spilling through the broken windows, Elena sat down at an old piano in one of the rooms. Her fingers touched the keys, and the sound filled the empty space with life again. Alexander stood nearby, listening quietly. It wasn't just music anymore. It was hope. The morning after the gala, the world seemed brighter for Elena. The sunlight streaming through the windows of the mansion felt warmer than ever. She hadn't slept much. Her mind was still replaying the sound of applause from the night before, the faces of the people standing and cheering, and the proud look on Alexander's face as he clapped for her. For the first time in years, she didn't feel small. She felt seen. When she came downstairs, the staff congratulated her with genuine smiles. Even the quietest servants, who usually kept their heads down, couldn't help but whisper words of pride. She thanked them all shyly, still not used to being the center of attention. Later that morning, she found Alexander in the study, standing by the window with a cup of coffee. He turned when she entered, and his expression softened immediately. "There she is, the star of the night," she laughed lightly, shaking her head. "Please don't call me that. I still can't believe all of it happened." "It did," he said simply. "And you earned every bit of it. You were incredible, Elena." She blushed slightly, looking down. "I just played from the heart. That's all I know how to do," he nodded. "That's what made it so special." There was a pause filled with quiet comfort. Then Alexander said, "You've been offered something." She frowned. "Offered what?" He handed her a letter. It was from the city's music conservatory, the same institution that once rejected her father's academy proposal years ago. She read it slowly, her hands trembling. They were offering her a position as a piano instructor and a performance partner for their next season. I don't understand, she whispered. Why would they want me? He smiled. Because they finally recognized your talent. You didn't need their approval before, but now they're the ones asking for your time. She looked up at him, emotion rising in her chest. I don't know what to do. Do what feels right, he said softly. You've always known where your heart belongs. She set the letter down and took a deep breath. The school we're building, my father's school, that's where my heart is. I want to stay with that. He nodded, seeming both proud and relieved. Then that's what you'll do. The following weeks were busy. Construction workers, architects, and decorators filled the old academy site. Elena visited every day, overseeing small details and making sure the rooms felt warm and welcoming. She chose soft colors for the walls, wide windows to let in light, and space for young musicians to gather, talk, and learn freely. She wanted it to be a place where no child felt unwelcome because of money or background. Music, she believed, belonged to everyone. One afternoon, as she walked through the nearly finished hall, she stopped to look at a small framed photo that had been placed on a piano. It was of her father, smiling, standing in front of the old academy years ago. Someone had found it in the city's records and brought it to her. She touched the glass gently, whispering, "We did it, Papa." Alexander arrived a few moments later, carrying a rolled-up document. I thought you might want to see this, he said, handing it to her. She unrolled it carefully. It was the official deed, stamped and signed, naming her as the founder and director of the Cruz Music School. Beneath her name, in small letters, it read, "Supported by Reed Holdings Foundation." She looked at him in surprise. You made it a foundation? He nodded. It's not just about fixing what was broken. It's about making sure it stays right in the future. No one should be able to take this place away again. Her eyes softened. You've changed, Alexander. He smiled faintly. Maybe I just finally started listening. As the opening day approached, excitement grew. Flyers spread around the town and families began signing up their children. Reporters wrote about the new academy built on the ruins of the old one, a story of redemption and dreams reborn. But for Elena, it wasn't about fame or news. It was about giving back what she had once lost. On the day of the grand opening, the academy was filled with people. The rooms buzzed with laughter and music. Small children ran through the halls, their parents watching proudly. The smell of fresh paint mixed with the faint scent of polished wood and flowers. Elena stood at the entrance, greeting each guest with a warm smile. She wore a simple blue dress, nothing fancy, but she looked radiant. The mayor gave a short speech about perseverance and generosity, and then it was Elena's turn to speak. She stepped forward, her heart beating fast. This place, she began softly, was once my father's dream. He believed that music could change lives. I lost that dream for a long time, but thanks to kindness, faith, and forgiveness, it found its way back. This school isn't just for me. It's for anyone who has ever been told they don't belong. Here, everyone belongs. The crowd clapped warmly. Some had tears in their eyes. Alexander stood near the back, his hands folded, smiling quietly. He didn't want attention. He didn't need it. He was just proud to see her standing there, fulfilling her destiny. When the ceremony ended, Elena invited the children to gather around the piano. Let's play something together, she said with a grin. The little ones giggled, their fingers awkwardly touching the keys as she guided them. Soon the hall filled with laughter and scattered notes that somehow came together into a melody that was pure and joyful. As she played with them, Alexander walked up to her quietly. When she finished, he said, "You've created something beautiful, Elena. Your father would be proud." She smiled, looking at the children. He's here in every note. They walked outside together, watching the sunset behind the building. The golden light bathed everything in warmth. For a moment, neither spoke. They just stood there, content in the quiet. After a while, Alexander said, "I'm stepping back from the company." Elena turned to him, surprised. "Why?" he smiled. "Because I want to start something new, something that matters. I've spent my whole life chasing numbers and contracts. I think it's time I learned what it means to create, not just to own." She nodded slowly. "You'll be good at it," he laughed softly. "We'll see. Maybe you can teach me," she smiled. "I think you've already learned the most important part, how to listen." The next months were peaceful. The academy grew quickly, filled with students from different places and families. Elena taught them not just how to play, but how to feel music, to understand it as a way to speak without words. She encouraged them to compose their own songs, to tell their own stories through sound. Sometimes, when she played alone in the evenings, Alexander would visit. He often sat in the back of the room listening quietly, his eyes thoughtful. They didn't talk much about the past anymore. They didn't need to. What once was guilt and pain had become something else: connection, trust, and understanding. One evening, as she finished playing, he approached her with a small envelope. "This came for you," he said. Inside was an invitation. Her performance at the City Conservatory had been rescheduled, and they wanted her to perform again, this time representing her academy. She smiled softly. "It seems life doesn't forget easily," he grinned. "Maybe it just gives us another chance." She nodded. "Then I'll take it." When she walked onto that stage weeks later, she wasn't the frightened maid who had once been forced to play to prove her worth. She was a teacher, a musician, and a woman who had rebuilt a dream from ashes. Her music that night wasn't